I'm Jackie King from King's Automotive. Today we're installing struts and springs on the E92 M3. We're using H&Rs, and then we're using Bilstein B8 rear shocks and Bilstein B6 front struts. You're supposed to use Bilstein B8s all around whenever you go lowering, but the B8s were on a huge back order, and we want to get ready for summer, so we're just going with the B6s. A lot of people lower on stock struts, and they're totally fine. This should be fine. I'm taking off the interior panel on the driver's side first. Ralphie's going to do the passenger side. So far, I've removed 3 of these pins, get a flat head under it, push it out, and then you just pull the whole thing out. Once you get this interior panel cover apart, there's a little cover on top of the shock. It just pulls right off, and then you'll expose the top nut. You kind of just got to feel for it. Right under this cover, you can feel for the nut. You don't have to take off the trunk panel, but for video purposes and clarity purposes, we want to take out the whole liner just so we can see where the top nut is for the shock. And this is the nut you're going to be trying to take off. Usually you could just, it's sitting here on the rear left, panels here, you can kind of just push it back. It's cover on top, you pop off, and then you just, undo it.
These seat buckle harness things, you have to unbolt this T30 right here. There's one on this side, there's one on that side.
Top nut for the shock is going to be a 16 millimeter. Hopefully it doesn't spin with us. It might want to spin with you. For us, since we're not really reusing the old shock, I just gutted it off. Probably don't want to do that on a new shock because you'll burn the seal. You gotta be careful with these because sometimes this piece separates because it's just held on by glue from the factory. And this piece will fall into the cavity of the frame, and it's literally impossible to take out. Just make sure you're grabbing this piece too so it doesn't accidentally fall in. And once you undo that, we can go to the bottom of the car. Once we got the top undone, we're gonna want to undo the bottom bolt, 18 mil, just loosen it up. And after you undo this bolt and take it out, it's pretty much done for the shock.
You said that's an 18?
Yep. God damn. Yeah, it's a longy boy. There's no nut on the other side. The control arm itself is threaded. In case you guys don't see a nut on the other side, don't start freaking out. After you get that undone, you can just kind of pry it loose. Maybe a bigger pry bar will help. That's sort of loose. Drop it down a little. Should be good. Take out all the bushings and grommet that part of shock, and you can literally compress it with your hand. Once you compress it, you kind of just wiggle it out of its perch. We could show it on the other side. So once you have the old shocks taken off, basically you're just gonna assemble everything. If your components are good, you can usually just reuse everything, but we want to do the best job we can, so we're just replacing all these stock rubbers. There's nothing really wrong with them. The one thing that we will be reusing is going to be these metal support cups. They basically stop the shock from going through the unibody. Unlike super old cars that live in the salt belt, though, sometimes they actually rust through, and then the shock comes through the unibody, but this looks like it's in really good condition. We're going to take the old cup, put the new bellow on it, and just assemble it all onto the new Bilstein B8. It's got a pretty good press fit. You'll know when it's all the way in. Take off the nut. Just slides right on. Then you have the lower mount. Just goes on. Grommet goes on. It's a pretty tight fit. And that's it, fully assembled. And we'll put this back in. We got a new upper mount and pretty much ready to go.
Sometimes with new struts, you have to pre-compress them to break them loose because they've been sitting expanded for so long. There you go. Look at that. So I am throwing my clothes. A lot of times on these, we'll actually just super glue this bump stop to the top just so it stays, because when it looks like this, it kind of just looks like shit. So we'll probably do that after we bolt it from the top.
Another thing to note, if you get a new upper shock mount, you cannot use this nut on the V8. On most coilovers, it actually changes thread pitch. So that's why they supply you with this new nut. So what you can do is you can cut the, basically cut the cage of this out. So that way you can just swap out a nut, because right now it's like trapped in there. So in a sec, we're gonna just, take a screwdriver and bend the tabs and then take the nut out.
Just guide it in. All right. We just have some basic crazy glue. You don't have to go too crazy. As long as it has some applied. And just make sure it adheres so that there's no problems.
It's got a pretty good press fit regardless. This isn't really the most essential part. We just hate lifting things up and seeing that the bump stop has fallen. It'll still do its job if it's fallen. It makes it look like something is broken. All right, so we'll drop it down. So now we're gonna take the new upper shock mount and see what we can do. Free up this caged nut. Don't do that. There's 3 tabs. I just got it underneath. We got the top mount with the nut that came with it taken out, and we got the nut that came with the Bilstein shock. It sits in there pretty good, so you don't have to worry about the tabs. Just make sure your strut's poked all the way through. Slide the top mount on, throw a nut on, tighten her down. Good to go for this. Another note about the Bilstein top nut, it actually switched to a 17 mil. So we're just gonna get a wrench, hold the center of the shock, tighten it down. We're using a ratcheting wrench with a 5mm hex to counter hold the center of the shock. So those tabs kind of are getting in the way. You can still do it without it. Just gonna switch over to the open-ended. If you feel like cutting off the 3 tabs on your new mount, you can. Not really necessary. These don't have to go crazy tight. Probably could get a torque spec on this, but the problem is it's not really gonna be easy to torque it because you have to counter hold it. There isn't a torque wrench that has a pass-through. Top is tightened down. Just put the cover back on. Has a little arrow. Yeah, the arrow faces inward. We're not going to tighten the AT on the bottom just yet because we're going to have to drop the control arms to install lowering springs, and then we're going to tighten everything up. Also reload everything as well. After we've tightened up both of the top nuts of the shocks, you're basically free to throw the paneling of the interior back in. For now, we're gonna raise the car up, undo the lower control arms, and slide in the springs and tighten down the bottom bolt of the shock, and then we should be good to go for the rear end. Since we already undid the lower shock mount, the only bolt that we'll have to undo is this. Another thing to keep note of is on this, there's the headlight level adjustment sensor. A lot of people forget that it's there, so they'll undo this bolt and then just pull the control down and totally snap that. If you snapped it, really, no one would ever know. But obviously, you don't want to be snapping your sensors. Won't ever throw an error code or anything like that. So just be very careful. It should just be a 10mm and it'll come right out. That worked. Do that. The headlight adjustment is only on the driver's side, so on the other side you don't have to worry about it. Another thing that we want to make a note of is the bottom spring purse. There's actually 2 different tabs. They do have to be located in a certain position. So there's a larger flat tab and there's a smaller half round tab. The half round tab will actually go into this little pocket in the lower control arm, and the flat end will protrude on the other side. So once we get it in there, we'll show you guys what it looks like. 21 both ends. Just gonna start it off. People that are DIYing at home, you're gonna want to get a jack underneath here to support the weight of everything, because if you take this bolt out, the spring, there's a good chance the spring's gonna want to shoot this control arm down. Since we're on a lift, we're just gonna use the screw jack. Support the weight of the whole assembly, then we're gonna tap the bolt out. So once you take out the bolt, just start undoing your screw jack. This will slowly decompress the tension from the spring. Once you get to this point, you can literally just pull down on the upper control arm, slide your spring out, and then we'll be able to slide a new spring back in. You got two perches, upper and a lower. We're just gonna transfer them over. There's a groove in which the spring sits in, so just make sure you take note of that on both sides. Now, here's the old spring. With these, we usually just clean them up. There's all this crud. It doesn't really do anything if you don't clean it up, but sometimes it can make noise. It's an Agria's interior cleaner, but that's just Dawn dish soap that we mixed. Oh. You don't really gotta go crazy on this as long as all the dirt is out. Not crazy difference, but there's also different spring rates.
Right,
so
right.
It's not just the overall length. We're gonna assemble it onto our new spring. These springs are non-directional, so the way I like to do it, I just like to make like right side up because there's lettering on the spring. So that's it, ready to go back in.
Don't forget about it.
You see the little half circle one is in this hole, and the flat one's gonna come out the other way. Just make sure your spring is centered on the control arm as well, because there is a perch that it sits in. If you see these two, it's gonna be pretty good, but you just wanna double check and make sure it's centered. And then now the next step, for the people that are using floor jacks, you know, this is basically the same action. We're just gonna compress the spring using the jack, and then we'll compress the spring enough to the point where the holes in the lower control arm will line up with the lower shock and the knuckle, and then we'll be good to go. So the objective is to line up this bolt through that hole. Obviously it's gonna fight you because the other control arms are holding it in, but you know, we'll get there. Once you line up pretty good, I think it should wanna go. Put a nut on the other side. This shock also has a little perch that you can see. There's a recess in the lower control arm. So we're just gonna jack it up to that point. You can see the holes start to line up. The front of this bolt has a little guide. So, you know, once you line up the hole like 80% of the way, you should be able to just tap it. Go by hand first, obviously. Make sure your threads are catching. And then if you're feeling bold, then gun it on. But once I start seeing the thread protrude a little, I'll know I'm good. Good to go. Torque spec's not crazy essential on these, but for the most part, we just tighten it down, check it by hand. That's pretty much good.
It's also important to tighten everything down while the jack is supporting the weight of the car. It's a process called preloading. Anything that has a bushing, you usually want to preload it. Bushings are only designed to flex between a specific range, and if you just gun it while the suspension is hanging either all the way down or all the way up, and then it tries to flex, it can flex too far and actually tear the bushing prematurely. So.
All right, now for the driver's side, one last thing that I not want to forget is putting that bolt back in for the headlight adjuster. There is a tab on this that you line up to with the hole over here next to the bolt. It can only really go on one way. On to you, sir.
Rinse and repeat for the passenger side. Seated properly. Make sure this tab, it's usually the longer one that passes through. Or the skinnier one, I'm sorry. The fatter one, it just hangs over here. Sometimes these sit at a weird angle, so as you're raising the lower control arm, it can actually cock the bushing that's inside the knuckle. In extreme cases, you can actually probably tear one of the boots, so you just gotta make sure. Keep an eye on the bushing. As you can see here, as I'm pushing up the lower control arm, this part of the bushing is actually getting cocked. Get all the weight off of it and try to realign it better. Grab a screwdriver, stick it through the center of it, and you can just adjust accordingly. There we go. It's sitting a lot more flush and it just pops in. Always be careful, like Jackie said before, always be careful when you're starting the thread, because you can cross thread something and not even know it until you're a few threads in, and now you kind of fucked. So just make sure, always go light. If you see how I'm gripping the ratchet, I'm gripping it at its highest point, so I have the least amount of leverage, which means the least chance of actually cross threading it.
Least amount of torque.
Yeah, the least amount of torque, because cross-threading any kind of thread is not a fun situation. As I'm ratcheting, I'm taking note of any resistance. If it feels abnormal, I'm definitely gonna back out, but this is going in pretty smooth, so it's safe to say that this is lining up pretty well. At this point, we're just gonna send it. Okay, we're gonna leave that loose. Now for the preloading, we're gonna try to replicate the car's natural position. Just eyeball it. It looks like how it would sit on the ground, so at that point, it's safe to say that it's ready to preload. Now we can just tighten everything. Now it's just a matter of putting all the push pins that we originally took out and putting them back in their respective place. Don't forget the leather stripping.
So these are the two fillets, right?
Yep. There's one already in there. You can see it. It's located in this little hole. And then this one's right here.
Start off by taking the wheel studs, undo the sway bar link that's connected to the strut. It's probably gonna spin with you. You're gonna have to counter hold it from the back side. The back side, there's a 19 mil to counter hold it. Front nut is a 16. I wanna undo the center nut of the strut mount. That way we don't have to worry about taking out the spring and then compressing the spring on the ground. We're just gonna use the weight and the control arms of the car to kind of do that job, because there are washers that we need to transfer over. Every component that we're putting on is gonna be new minus those washers, because it's like the rear, they're just huge pieces of metal that probably don't go bad. And BMW wanted like 30 bucks for each washer, so it would have been like 120 bucks in washers. Not really necessary. Pop off the cover for the strut. Get a nice pick tool in there maybe. There we go. So this is the nut that we're gonna wanna undo. To support the weight of the front knuckle, we're gonna use a floor jack. Just helps us slowly release that. We'll raise it back up, disconnect some of the wires so they don't potentially get tugged on. Because once you take the strut out, this whole assembly is gonna want to tilt forward. And then, you know, these wires, even though they look thick, they're probably like 0 gauge inside, so you can rip on them easily. Have an internal break, and you're not gonna know because the outside will look fine. So just disconnect them, get them out of the way for the safest bet. We're gonna undo the strut. We're gonna do 16 millimeters on both sides. Bracket comes out. This bracket's what was holding the 2 wires on the brake line before. You can just shove this to the side, and then we're gonna split open this knuckle, and hopefully we got enough space to tap it out for the strut to come out. I just get a chisel in here and punch it through. Since we're not reusing the strut, we could probably even tap on the strut on that nice little perch that they gave us. This is the washer that BMW wants 30 bucks for, and there's another one on top. I mean, it's a pretty beefy washer, so at the same time, it's not worth that much. Let me take out this tie rod and see where that gets us. Oh, there we go. Watch out for his fender. Take off this washer when it wants to come off. Wrestle with the spring. Extract the washer. That's the only thing we're probably gonna need from this. Take out this old spring and bellow. The rear shocks, non-directional. You can install left and right, doesn't really matter. Fronts have a difference because of how the sway bar mounts. This mount's actually still pretty good, but since we're here, we're gonna refreshen them. Brand new, genuine BMW mounts. Unfortunately, there's no aftermarket option. These puppies come in around, I think they're over 100 each. So, you know, usually for the people that are trying to save a little bit more money, you probably don't need to get a new mount. You know, there's no sound coming from the bearing. There's a little bit, so that's normal. There's no tears in the rubber. Everything up here is good. So, you know, if you want to save a little money, you don't necessarily have to get new mounts. There's a locator. Make sure that's fully seated. This lower spring perch will actually set you up for where the spring is going to go. You can probably install these upside down or right side up, but I just always make sure the letters are facing right side up. The washer on there. Washer goes on, strut mount goes on. Get the upper washer. So the beauty of lowering springs is that you don't need a spring compressor. Once you assemble all the washers on there, pretty much good to go. Because not everyone has a pass-through, so we're just going to show it with using a wrench and a, you know, a hex. Got the strut mount and the strut bolted to the frame. Just gonna, you know, pull down this little, give this a little flex, slide this into the perch. You will have to watch out for this dowel. Once you start putting this knuckle back into the strut, this dowel has to go in between where we were spreading it. Flex these into each other. Start going. And then we're gonna raise the car and use a screw jack and just start putting it up. For the people at home, if you're using a floor jack, that works too. Same principle. You just want to raise the whole assembly, line everything up, tighten it down, and then we should be done with this side. Make sure it's not binding. There we go. Clock it to meet the dowel. Nice and easy. If you stop seeing it go in, it's probably binding. Just tap it a little more. See the strut sit on the bottom of this knuckle. There's a bottom bevel on the strut. I'll show you on the other one. So once this end reaches the knuckle, you'll see it sit down perfectly. If this end hasn't reached the knuckle yet, you're not all the way in. So put this little piece back in, the holder. And tighten down. The sensors are color coded, gray to gray, white to white. Can't really mess it up. The sway bar link in. Super. So we're back on the driver's side. We're just gonna start by disconnecting these wires again, just so we don't have a chance of ripping them. Last thing you wanna do is be doing your lowering springs and end up having to get a $100 ABS sensor. Now, same thing as in the rear. On the driver's side, you do have the headlight level sensor. You're gonna wanna disconnect that as well. We're gonna start disconnecting a sway bar link, and then we're gonna move down to the headlight sensor, and we'll show you guys once we're there. We got a 16mm nut in the front and a 19mm counter hole in the back. Headlight level sensor, again, it's a 10mm. You're gonna need a 10mm counter hole on the other side as well. We're gonna take off the headlight adjust sensor, counter hold in with a 10mm on the back, 10mm nut on the front, thread that back in so we don't lose it. We're gonna disconnect the strut from the knuckle, 16 on both sides. Now we're gonna go all the way down and undo the strut mount, 21. Very aggressive spring. More jack out of the way. And we'll lift it up. Now we got this out of here. Just a little more space. Come out. Gotta watch the fender. Fun stuff. Get the upper washer on. Get the nut on. You want to learn how to be a mechanic?
No.
Come on, son. Hey. Now we're just gonna tighten the knuckle with the strut. Then we can undo the screw jack. We're gonna tighten up the sway bar leg, start putting the sensors back together. The headlight adjustment sensor. We double check everything by hand. Put the wheels back on, and we'll do a fitment check right after. With lowering springs, they're obviously going to settle a little. Since we put out all new mounts, it'll probably be a little higher than it should be as well, because the rubber does compress over time. So as you're tightening down, just always remember to tighten the star pattern. It just ensures that the wheel is perfectly seated to the hub. You don't want to be tightening it against the wheel. Once you move it off the lift, because right now it's like the tires are holding it in place.
It looks higher?
It looks higher than